The courthouse steps in Thunder Bay were sheeted in freezing rain the morning Desmond Baptiste walked out of them with nothing left to lose, which was a strange thing to feel because he had walked in that morning fairly certain he had nothing left to lose already. The judge had corrected him on that. There had been, it turned out, one more thing: the shop. The little repair hangar off Arthur Street where he fixed the bush planes and the aging Cessnas that ferried supplies and people to the fly-in communities scattered up the far shore of the lake. That was gone now, too, signed over to satisfy a judgment 9 years in the making. The house on Juneau had gone 3 years back. The truck the year before that. His savings had emptied so slowly and so completely that he no longer remembered what it had felt like to have any. And now the shop, the one place that still smelled like something he'd built with his own 2 hands, belonged to an insurance company's holding subsidiary. And a lawyer named Trevor Halloran, who had never once, in 4 years of proceedings, looked Desmond in the eye. Mark Levasseur had died in a test aircraft 9 years ago, and the courts had spent nearly a decade making very sure that Desmond Baptiste paid for it. That was the short version. Desmond had stopped telling the long version to anyone but his daughter, and even then only the parts a child should hear. He came down the courthouse steps slow and careful because the ice didn't care about your grief, and the small crowd near the doors parted for him the way people part for a man they've decided is unlucky, as though bad fortune were a thing you could catch by standing too close. Somewhere behind him he heard Halloran laugh at something, low and easy, the laugh of a man who has already counted the settlement and is thinking about lunch. Desmond didn't turn around. He'd learned a long time ago that turning around cost you more than it ever gave back. He made it maybe a dozen steps toward the parking lot, toward the borrowed Corolla with the heater that only worked on the highest setting when he heard the other sound. Not the traffic on Miles Street. Something above it. A deep, steady beat coming down through the sleet, heavy and deliberate. The rotor wash of an aircraft descending, where no aircraft had any business descending. Now, before anyone writes in to say a helicopter can't just drop out of the sky onto a downtown block. You're right, and it didn't. There were 2 municipal marshals in the cleared lot beside the courthouse annex. Orange cones set out since dawn. A temporary landing permit that had cost somebody a great deal of money and 3 phone calls to the city. Somebody had planned this. Somebody had known exactly when Desmond would walk out those doors and had wanted to be there when he did. The machine came down onto the annex lot clean as a stone settling into snow. A matte black medevac helicopter with a single word painted along its flank, Corvid. And when the door slid open and a woman stepped down onto the ice in a charcoal coat with the collar turned up against the wind, half the people on that sidewalk knew her face. Because Vivian Cross did not make a habit of going anywhere quietly. And going anywhere at all usually made the business pages. She didn't look at the crowd. She looked straight across the salt-stained lot at a broke man in a work jacket he'd owned for 11 years. And she said his name like it was a fact she'd been carrying around for a while. Mr. Baptiste. A pause, the wind pulling at her coat. I need you. If you've ever been at the bottom of something and had the world reach down for you when you'd stopped expecting it to, stay with this one. This is a story about a man who lost everything a court could take and kept the one thing nobody thought to reach for. If that's the kind of thing you're here for, go ahead and subscribe now, because there's a great deal more of it where this came from. 3 years before Mark Levasseur died, and long before any of the rest of it, Desmond Baptiste had been the sort of man other people in a room deferred to without quite knowing why. He'd come up in Scarborough, the son of a mother who cleaned offices on the night shift and a father who'd driven a delivery route until his knees gave out. And he'd gotten to the University of Toronto on the strength of a mind that took machines apart in its sleep. He understood airflows the way some people understand music. Not as a set of equations, but as a thing with a shape and a temper. Something you could feel leaning against a wing. By 31, he was the lead systems engineer on the coldest, most stubborn problem in Canadian aviation. The problem was ice. Everyone who flies the north knows the truth of it. The machines can't always hold. Freezing rain, supercooled droplets, the specific brutal geometry of a wind that comes off open water in January and hits an airframe already heavy with accretion. Aircraft that fly clean and steady in a Toronto spring turn stubborn and dangerous over Superior in a storm, and the people who need them most. The fly-in communities where a burst appendix or a difficult birth becomes a death sentence if the plane can't come are exactly the people the weather punishes hardest. Desmond had grown up hearing about it secondhand. Then he'd made it his whole life. His system was elegant in a way that made older engineers uneasy. Instead of reacting to ice after it formed, waiting for the sensors to register the added weight, the changed lift, and then scrambling the control surfaces to compensate, his design read the conditions coming. Air temperature, droplet size, humidity, the pressure gradient half a kilometer ahead, all of it feeding a control logic that repositioned the aircraft surfaces and shed the load before the stall could begin. It didn't fight the ice, refused to be surprised by it. He'd called the aircraft it was built for the Kestrel, after a small hawk that hunts by hanging perfectly still in a wind that should throw it around, and doesn't. The firm was called Vantara Aerospace, and the man who ran the Kestrel program was named Gordon Rourke. Desmond had trusted Gordon the way a younger man trusts an older one who seems to be on his side. Gordon was smooth and encouraging and always aware of the timeline, the investors, the certification window, the competitors, the money that was patient right up until the day it wasn't. Desmond told himself the pressure was Gordon's job to carry so the engineers wouldn't have to. He believed that right up until the morning of the flight test. Here is the thing that took Desmond 9 years to understand, so we'll just say it plainly and let him catch up in his own time. The code that flew in the Kestrel that day was not the code he'd submitted. His final build, the corrected one, the one that had passed every simulation, the one with the crosswind and icing instabilities resolved, had been replaced with an earlier iteration. A build he'd moved past weeks before, one with a known flaw in exactly the conditions the test was meant to prove. Desmond didn't know that then. Nobody told him. The aircraft went up into a clear, cold sky with Marc Levasseur at the controls, and 40 minutes later, in a bank of unexpected freezing fog off the escarpment, the stabilization logic reacted a half-second too late to a load it should have anticipated, and the Kestrel came down. Marc had a wife named José and 2 boys under 10. Desmond had gone to the funeral and stood at the back and been unable to make himself walk up to the front because, what? The investigation blamed the software. The software had Desmond's name on it. Vantara's lawyers, coached by Gordon, positioned the firm as the responsible steward that had trusted a brilliant but reckless engineer. And by the time it was over, Desmond had lost his career, his certification standing, and the beginnings of a lawsuit that would follow him for the rest of the decade. His wife, Ruth, was already sick by then. The cancer had been quiet for a year and then it wasn't. And the 2 ruins arrived in his life at almost the same time, the professional one and the human one, so that he never got to grieve either cleanly. Ruth died in the spring. Desmond took their daughter, Nia, who was 4 and had her mother's steady, unhurried eyes, and he did the only thing he could think to do, which was to get in the truck and drive north until the city stopped meaning anything. And he stopped in Thunder Bay because that was as far as the truck felt like taking them. He fixed airplanes, not the kind he used to build. The small, honest kind, the float planes and the old workhorses that kept the North stitched together. He was good at it, and being good at it was almost enough. He rented a hangar bay, hung his diagrams on the back wall out of old habit, and raised his daughter, and did not let himself think, most days, about the Kestrel. The lawsuit ground on in the background of his life like weather. Every couple of years it took something else from him. He'd stopped expecting it to leave anything behind. And then a helicopter landed on the ice outside a courthouse, and a woman worth more money than the whole city of Thunder Bay looked at him like he was the answer to a question she'd been asking for a long time. Vivian Cross did not do small talk, which Desmond would come to appreciate more than he could have explained. She got him out of the wind into the cabin and told him the shape of it before the rotors had fully spun down. Corvid Aerospace was building a cold-weather medevac aircraft. Not a retrofit, not a compromise. A purpose-built machine meant to reach the places the current fleet couldn't, in the conditions that killed people, the storms that grounded everyone else. She had the funding, the airframe, the certification pathway, a hangar outside the city, and one problem she could not solve. In icing and crosswind together, the exact conditions the North specialized in. Her aircraft stabilization system couldn't hold. It reacted. It corrected after the fact. In a benign sky, it was fine. In the sky that mattered, it was a coffin, and she knew it, and she was not willing to launch it and find out the hard way whose children waited on the ground. Every engineer I've hired tells me the problem is unsolvable at our timeline, she said. Then I read an accident report from 9 years ago, and a design philosophy in it that wasn't unsolvable. It was the opposite. It was solved, and then it was buried. She looked at him. The name on it was yours. Desmond was quiet for a while. That design killed a man, he said finally. It was the sentence he'd been made to say. So many times he almost believed the version of it he'd been handed. Vivienne didn't flinch. Did it, she said. Not a question. She let it sit there, a small, strange stone he wasn't ready to pick up yet. She offered him a consulting arrangement. No permanent commitment, no promises either way. Come to the facility, look at the aircraft, tell her whether the man in that old report still existed. She would pay him whether or not he stayed, enough that the number itself was a kind of apology for the last 9 years. Though she didn't say so, Desmond thought about Nia, and the borrowed Corolla, and the fact that he no longer owned the wrench in his own hand. He thought about the back wall of a hangar that wasn't his anymore. "I have a daughter," he said. "She's 13. She comes with me or it doesn't happen." "There's a good school 10 minutes from the facility," Vivienne said, as though she'd already checked. She had. The Corvid facility sat on a windswept lot northwest of the city, a single long hangar and a low office block and a runway that ran off toward a horizon of black spruce and gray sky. Desmond's first morning there, the lead engineer met him at the door with the particular stiff courtesy of a woman who has heard about a legend and reserved judgment on all of it. Her name was Billionaire, and she had built the current stabilization system, and she did not love the idea of a ghost from a 9-year-old crash report walking in to tell her it was wrong. She was too good at her job to let that get in the way for long. Desmond asked to see the code, not the summaries, not the architecture diagrams, the base logic, where it pulled its inputs, what it was optimizing for. Priya glanced at Vivienne, who had come in without anyone noticing, and Vivienne nodded once. For most of that first day, Desmond sat with the code and the mechanical specs and a series of coffees, saying almost nothing, and the other engineers drifted in and out to look at the strange, quiet man from up north as if he might do a trick. He didn't do a trick. What he did, around 4 in the afternoon, was get up and walk to the whiteboard and draw a control loop that looked nothing like theirs. "Your system corrects after the deviation," he said. "The ice forms, the load changes, the sensors read it, the surfaces respond. Every step of that is a step behind the weather. Up here, the weather doesn't give you the steps." He tapped the board. "You're treating ice like an event." "It's not an event. It's a forecast. Feed it the droplet size and the temperature gradient and the pressure ahead, and the aircraft can know where the load is going to arrive a half-second before it does. Preposition the response. Shed the accretion before it changes the lift. The airframe's already leaning into a gust that hasn't hit yet." The room got quiet in the specific way a room gets quiet when someone has said the thing everybody was circling without knowing how to reach. Priya stared at the loop for a long time. Then she picked up a marker and started poking holes in it. Good holes, hard questions, the kind that meant she'd stopped defending her own work and started stress testing his. They went until 7 that evening. When Desmond finally drove back into the city to pick up Nia from the after-school program, he had a temporary badge in his jacket pocket, and Priya had agreed to run a new simulation series overnight, and he realized with something close to fear that he had enjoyed himself for the first time in 9 years. Nia noticed. She noticed everything. She looked at her father across the fogged-up interior of the Corolla and said, "You're different," he said. "Good different," she said, and went back to her book, and Desmond had to look hard at the road for a minute. By the end of the first week, the grudging respect had arrived, which in an engineering shop is the only kind worth having. People stopped their side conversations when Desmond walked in. They brought him the questions they used to bring Priya, and Priya, to her enormous credit, let them, because she cared more about the aircraft than about being the smartest person in the hangar. Vivienne stayed present without hovering, working from a laptop at the far end of the table, taking her calls out in the cold, appearing at exactly the moments something mattered and vanishing when it didn't. Desmond hadn't agreed to anything permanent. She hadn't pushed. The arrangement suited them both, and both of them knew it, and neither of them said so. It was on the 9th day that everything Desmond thought he understood about his own life came apart. He'd asked Priya for the old Kestrel test files, his old files from Vantera from the flight that killed Mark Levasseur, not for any reason he could have defended out loud, just because he was working in the same problem space and old instincts told him to check his own history for anything useful. Vivienne, it turned out, had already obtained the complete archive through channels she declined to describe, which told Desmond something about how long she'd been thinking about him before that morning at the courthouse. He was cross-referencing an Isings model when he found the version number. It was in the metadata of a test log from the day of the crash. A small thing, a build identifier tucked in a header nobody had ever needed to read. And it was wrong. The algorithm version recorded in the flight log was not the version Desmond had submitted. It was an earlier build, an iteration he'd moved past 3 weeks before the test, one he'd documented, in writing, as unstable in exactly the icing and crosswind conditions the flight encountered. His corrected final build had a different signature entirely, and that signature appeared nowhere in the flight record. Someone had swapped the files. Someone had pulled out the version that worked and flown the version that didn't, and then logged the flight as though it had run on his submitted work, and let a man die and let Desmond wear it for 9 years. He sat very still. Outside the window, the late light had gone the flat pewter gray of a northern afternoon's sliding toward dark. He could hear the ventilation and nothing else. And then he did the only thing he knew how to do with a fault he'd never seen before. He stopped feeling and started diagnosing. He pulled the full record. He went through every document methodically, the way he'd trace a failure in an engine he'd never opened. No assumptions, no conclusions, following each thread as far as it went before letting himself see the pattern. Access logs. Change histories. The chain of who had touched the build directory in the 72 hours before the flight and the one signature that appeared where it had no reason to be, authorizing a rollback that no engineer had requested. Gordon Rourke. By the time Desmond was done, it was past 8, and the building had emptied out around him, and he sat in the quiet with the whole shape of it finally in front of him, and understood for the first time in 9 years that the question he'd been living inside. What did I do wrong? Had the wrong verb in it. He hadn't done anything wrong. He'd been buried. The timeline had been slipping, the certification window closing, the investors restless. And Gordon had made a bet that the earlier build would hold well enough to pass a demonstration flight and buy the program the months it needed. And the bet had cost Mark Levasseur his life. And when it did, Gordon had reached for the nearest man to hang it on, and the nearest man had been the one whose name was already on the work. Desmond drove home that night and sat in the parking lot of their apartment building for a while before he could go up. When he did, Nia was at the kitchen table drawing, as she often was. She drew aircraft, had for years, cross-sections and control surfaces she didn't fully understand but rendered with the patient accuracy of someone who intended to understand them eventually. She looked up at him. "Did something happen?" she asked. He thought about all the ways to answer that. "I found out something," he said. "About a long time ago. Something that means it maybe wasn't my fault." Nia considered this the way she considered everything without hurry. "I already knew it wasn't your fault," she said, and went back to her drawing, and Desmond stood in his own kitchen and understood that his daughter had been carrying a faith in him that he had not been able to carry himself, and had been carrying it, quietly, the entire time. He told Vivian the next morning. He laid the whole record out on the long table, the version numbers, the access logs, Gordon's signature on a rollback that killed a man, and she looked at it for a long time with an expression that didn't change, and when she spoke, it wasn't about the past. "I know," she said. Desmond stared at her. "Not the details. Not this." She touched the edge of the printout. "But I read that accident report years ago, and it didn't hold together. The philosophy in the design and the failure in the flight didn't come from the same mind. I've bought and dismantled enough companies to know what a cover-up reads like from the outside. I didn't hire you because I felt sorry for you, Desmond. I don't do that." She met his eyes. "I hired you because I needed the best cold weather systems mind in the country, and 9 years ago somebody very deliberately convinced the country it didn't have one. I wanted to see if they were lying." "Yes," Vivian said. "I can see that now. Here's a thing worth stopping on because it's the whole hinge of it." Vivian Cross could have made this into a rescue. She could have played the benefactor, the rich hand lifting the fallen man, and plenty of people in her position would have because it feels good, and it makes a better photograph. She didn't. She needed him. That was the truth of it, cleaner and colder and far more dignifying than pity. The one thing 9 years of lawyers had never managed to take out of Desmond Baptiste was the exact thing the wealthiest woman in Canadian aerospace could not build without. And being needed, it turns out, will straighten a man's spine in a way that being saved never can. What they did about Gordon Rourke, they did carefully. Vivian had lawyers of her own, the kind who did not laugh on courthouse steps, and she put them on it quietly and completely. The evidence Desmond had found was real, but 9 years old and buried inside a defunct program's archive, and turning it into consequences would take time and patience and the sort of resources Desmond had never had access to in his entire life. For the first time, the fight was not his to carry alone in the dark. He handed the files over and let people whose job it was do the work, and he went back to the thing he was actually good at, which was building the aircraft that would make all of it mean something. Because that was the part that mattered, and Desmond never once lost sight of it. The reveal about Gordon was justice, and justice was good. But justice didn't fly a surgeon to a fishing camp in a whiteout. The Kestrel philosophy, resurrected in the Corvid airframe with 14 months of work behind it, might. Those 14 months were the best of Desmond's life, and he'd have told you that even knowing how they ended, which is a thing you can only say about the very best stretches of a life. The predictive stabilization system came together slowly, and then all at once, the way hard things do, Priya became something Desmond hadn't had since before the crash. A genuine colleague, someone who solved the same problem from a compatible angle, until they developed the wordless shorthand of two people finishing each other's diagrams. The team stopped treating Desmond like a ghost and started treating him like the reason the thing was going to work. He made a condition of his continued involvement. Vivienne agreed to it before he'd finished the sentence, that the program include a training facility for the emergency response crews in the northern communities who'd actually fly and maintain the aircraft, so the machine wouldn't be one more piece of southern technology dropped on the north and left to break with nobody to fix it. He'd spent 9 years fixing everyone else's aircraft in a rented bay. He knew what abandonment looked like from the ground. Nia thrived. The school near the facility had a shop program and a physics teacher who recognized what she was inside of a month, and she started coming to the hangar on weekends with a notebook. Sitting in a corner Priya had unofficially given her, asking questions that were, more and more often, good ones. Desmond watched his daughter fall in love with the thing that had nearly destroyed him, and understood that this was the shape of things being made right. Not the crash undone, which was impossible, but the meaning of it turned, finally, in a better direction. The lawyers did their work. Gordon Rourke, 9 years on, was a respected figure in the industry with a consultancy and a reputation and a great deal to lose, and he lost it in stages over that year as the evidence surfaced and the questions began and the people who'd trusted him started, one by one, to step back. By the time the aircraft was ready to fly, Gordon was in the early stages of a federal proceeding that everyone understood would take the better part of 2 years and end somewhere he would not enjoy. Marc Levasseur's widow, José, whom Desmond finally found the courage to call, listened to the whole of it in silence and then said the only thing that could have undone him, which was, "I never blamed you. Mark trusted your work. He told me it was the best he'd ever flown." Desmond had to sit on the floor of the hangar office for a while after that call. The first official demonstration flight was in October, and Vivienne, who could have filled a downtown ballroom with people impressed by their own attendance, declined the whole apparatus. No string quartet, no press gauntlet. Instead, they set out folding chairs on the tarmac outside the main hangar, a plain podium, coffee in paper cups. And the wind came off the lake cold and clean the way it does in October, carrying the first real bite of the winter coming. The people who came because they had a reason. 2 hospital administrators from northern districts whose patients had died over the years waiting for aircraft that couldn't come. Emergency coordinators from 3 fly-in communities. A search and rescue crew that had spent 4 months in the beta program and had opinions about every system on the machine, most of them good. Priya near the front with the engineers who'd built it, and Nia in the second row, in a jacket with her notebook in the pocket, sitting with the focused stillness of a girl who has decided to pay attention and means it. Desmond spoke from the podium without notes, because he wasn't a man who performed and he'd stopped trying to be. He talked about what the aircraft was for. Reaching a family stranded on a road, washed out in spring melt when nothing on wheels could get there. Putting a doctor on the ground at a settlement in a January storm that had, in every previous winter, simply meant the doctor couldn't come, and the person on the ground would have to survive on luck. Closing the distance between people who needed help and the people able to give it, in exactly the conditions where that distance had always been uncrossable. He did not mention Gordon Rourke. He did not mention the courthouse or Trevor Halloran or the 9 years. He thanked Vivienne and Priya and the team, and then he looked at his daughter in the second row, and she gave him a small, precise nod, so composed and so adult that the woman beside her laughed into her hand. The aircraft lifted off at 11 in the morning. It flew the profile they'd built to break it, a simulated icing envelope layered over a crosswind sequence off the escarpment. The exact combination of conditions that had killed the original Kestrel and killed every iteration since. And it held. Clean and steady and unsurprised, shedding the load before the load could change the lift, leaning into gusts a half-second before they arrived, doing what the design had been meant to do for 9 years while the man who designed it fixed other people's float planes in a rented bay in Thunder Bay. Nia watched with her head tipped all the way back and her mouth slightly open. She had forgotten entirely about the notebook. Afterward, when the crowd had begun to break apart into the small, warm knots of people who don't want to leave a good thing, Desmond found Vivienne at the far edge of the tarmac. Away from the others, her coat collar turned up against the October wind, watching the aircraft make a second slow pass before it came in to land. They stood together without talking for a while. The silence between them had become, over 14 months, the kind that doesn't need filling, the kind that means you've stopped managing the other person's presence and started, simply, sharing it. Halloran sent a letter, Desmond said. His clients want to open the settlement now that the record's changed. Vivienne almost smiled. They want a great many things. They can, Desmond agreed. He watched the aircraft. 9 years I thought I owed a debt I couldn't pay. Turns out I never owed it. No, she said, you didn't. She turned to look at him then, plainly, the way she asked everything that mattered. Any regrets? Desmond was quiet. He watched the aircraft complete its arc and start down toward the tarmac, the whole system tracking exactly through the crosswind, every surface holding precisely where it should, doing what it had been built to do for almost a decade while its maker waited out the years in the north. There was a version of his life where none of this had been taken from him, and he could see it, and he let himself see it, and then he let it go. Some, he said. He let the silence sit. Not about this. Vivienne held his gaze a moment longer, and whatever she was looking for, she found it, because she nodded once and looked back at the aircraft and didn't push past the answer into the parts he hadn't said. She understood the difference between the two. She always had. Nia appeared between them then, tugging at Desmond's sleeve with the specific urgency of a child who has been patient exactly as long as she is able, and has reached the far edge of it. She wanted to meet the pilot. Desmond told her she could, once the rotors had fully stopped. She crossed her arms and stationed herself at the edge of the tarmac and stood there in the cold with the fierce committed patience of someone who has made a decision and intends to see it through. And Vivienne watched her go and said quietly, "She's going to build these one day." "She's going to build whatever she decides to build," Desmond said. "Yes," Vivienne said. "That's exactly what I meant." He looked over at her. She was still watching Nia, but she was smiling. Not the measured, calibrated expression he'd seen her use in boardrooms and on the 6 o'clock news, but the real one underneath it, the one that reached her eyes and stayed there. Desmond didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The rotors slowed and stopped. Nia was already moving. Desmond Baptiste walked out of a courthouse one gray morning with nothing a court had the power to take. No house, no truck, no shop, no name he could clear, just a borrowed car and a 13-year-old who drew airplanes at the kitchen table and had never for one day believed the lie the whole country had agreed to tell about her father. And what this story turns out to be about isn't the helicopter, or the billionaire, or the man who spent 9 years keeping the truth buried to save his own timeline. It's about what happens when you stop measuring your worth by everything's been taken and start paying attention to what's still in your hands. Sometimes the worst morning of your life is only the runway clearing, and sometimes the person who comes for you when you've lost it all isn't there to save you at all. They're there because you're still holding the one thing nobody ever managed to take. If this one meant something to you, subscribe and stay a while. Every week there's another, about people who held on well past the point where holding on made any sense, and found out later, standing in a cold wind watching something they built fly, exactly why they did. We'll see you in the next one.